Does anybody actually listen to the recordings? Okay, people do. All right, good. I guess I'll keep doing it. So today, we are going to cover the most important topic of your lives. All about me. No, it's a joke. Like a joke, but less funny. We're going to talk about the thing. I've been giving the same lecture for about, I guess, 8 years now. I've modified the slides, obviously. But it's funny how, as the generations progress, what was shocking 8 years ago, people now take for granted. So that's a good thing in some ways, that the information has percolated down to the street level, I suppose, where you come in with a certain base knowledge. But still, people are in denial of some of the facts and possibly are ignorant of the pathways. So Sherrod and I were just talking about the monk debates that were on last week. I don't know if anyone else saw it. Anyone other than Sherrod and I watched the monk debates? Disappointing. The monk debates are this high-level scholarly debates that are hosted by U of T every few months. And if you have a chance to watch them, you really should. So a few years ago, one of the topics was actually a climate change topic. And they had some big shots arguing over that one. And one of the shocking takeaways from that debate was the denial side was arguing over how does climate change affect insecurity? No one's ever made that argument before, and everyone on the panel struggled to make the argument, whereas pretty much every one of my undergraduate students could have made a lucid argument as a result of work through this class. So I like to think that we're at the stage where the sort of connections are obvious, but we never know. And a few years ago, in Policy Options magazine, which is a newspaper put out in Ottawa, read mostly by politicians, there was a call by the Liberal Party strategists to make climate change the heart of their agenda going into the 21st century. And that was before Stéphane Dion became Liberal leader. He took that as his platform. And it did not resonate well because they didn't elucidate the connections well between climate change, health, wealth, employment, insecurity, etc. And we are going to go through some of those connections today, and I think you'll agree they're fairly obvious if you stop and think about it. But if you don't stop and think about it, you just think about temperature, and your thought process ends there. So today, climate change and health, as I mentioned, possibly the most important topic of the rest of your lives, because I believe this will be the defining phenomenon for your adult lives. I'll be dead by the time it gets, noticeably serious, so this is your issue. Good luck with that. All right, there it is. Climate change. This is a photo I took back in 2010. So half of my research takes place in the jungles of Guyana. I go there. I used to go there several times a year. So in February, this was the water source for a particular village near the Caribbean coast, but still, technically jungle. And that water source is the source of water for a community of about 100 people. That's what they bathe in, what they drink from, what they cook with, everything. Now, usually that's a fairly healthy river, but it depletes cyclically throughout the year. Here we have an unexpected drought. And this was a shocking unexpected drought because in the history, going back multiple generations orally from this population, they had not recalled a time in February when there is this little water. So while it's possible for certain communities and ecologies to be prepared for the cyclical availability and quality of water, it's not possible to plan for it when it is unpredictable. And that's really the state of affairs of the world, is that things like water supply, temperature variation, soil quality, agricultural product, these things are no longer predictable, so generations of experience are no longer applicable anymore. Hence the crisis in which we are sitting. By the way, if you look at that kind of situation, what kind of health effects immediately come to mind for the population relying on this water? What kinds of poor health outcomes did you expect? What kind of diseases? Infectious disease, enteric bacteria, all those wonderful things, including the inability to have basic hygiene, possibly depleted nutrition, because maybe this is the water supply for their crops as well. So it's a multifold problem. So climate change will affect population health everywhere. This much is true. In some places, it'll actually get better. We have to accept that possibility. But in the places where it'll get worse, it will be in, I gotta fix that one day, the slide keeps disappearing. Essentially what it says is that the places that are already impoverished are the places that are going to be most profoundly affected. And once again, that includes sub-Saharan Africa, which seems to have the brunt of most of the world's woes going back generations. So we mentioned sub-Saharan Africa struggles with economic issues, struggles with colonial issues, struggles with HIV, struggles with poverty, and now climate change threatens to have a profound and specific effect on that part of the world as well. And here is a quote from Stephen Lewis. Who knows who Stephen Lewis is? Every young Canadian should know who Stephen Lewis is. Again, as the years have gone by teaching this class, the numbers of people who know who he is have dwindled every year until now we have 0. That's great. Stephen Lewis was the former head of the Ontario NDP. He was the Canadian ambassador to the UN, and then after that he was the special UN ambassador for HIV/AIDS in Africa, one of this country's greatest intellectual leaders, especially around international health and development issues. And he was instrumental in negotiating the exclusion of AIDS drugs from those intellectual property laws I talked about a couple of lectures ago. So as a result, those copyright laws that would have pushed AIDS drugs prices through the roof are now exempt. So he was instrumental in that process. But he was, again, a leading intellectual when it comes to things like this. So he says, the places that are going to be hardest hit by climate change are precisely those areas affected by HIV/AIDS. In other words, Southern Africa. So let's go through some of the mechanisms by which climate change affects health. Again, some of these hopefully are obvious, but some might not be. So the leading mechanisms, first of all, heat waves. When you ask the average person on the street, how does quote-unquote global warming affect health, the first thing they'll think about is heat, because we're stuck with that ridiculous phrase, global warming. Because yes, the average temperature is increasing, but it's about, as I hope you know now, changes in climate. Some places will get slightly colder, some places slightly warmer. On average, the planet gets warmer. But because we got that term global warming, most people think of heat waves, and that's a real thing. We'll go over in detail what that means. Floods and storms. Again, when I first started teaching this course 8 years ago, that was a theory, but you see it now, right? This year alone, 3 or 4 massive super hurricanes in the Caribbean. These are direct effects of increasing water temperature, and it's only going to get worse, or at the very least, more common. Water scarcity, we'll talk about that. More diseases. So health sciences students understand this. With the spread of vectors and so forth, we're going to have an increased prevalence of communicable disease. Air pollution, we'll talk about that. And agricultural patterns. Again, most people don't think about that when they think about changes in climate. I think I've primed you for that by mentioning a few times already in this course, but I would like you to think about how, because agriculture is the foundation of civilization. What is the definition of civilization? Civilization began when we discovered agriculture 12 to 15,000 years ago. And that's always been subject to climate change. And this is not the first time, by the way, that climate change has affected human civilization. It's happened a number of times in the past. This is the first time it's happened at a global level, affecting a globalized economy and a singular global civilization. Civilization of the past have fallen due to climate change. Several Central American civilizations have been destroyed by it. Comes to mind right now is the Indus Valley civilization from 10,000 years ago, completely destroyed by localized climate change, usually affecting water quality and agriculture. But indirect methods, migration. And this is where the security institutions start taking note. Because movements of people affect governments in a very localized and short-term way. That leads to insecurity, as mentioned, and of course, economic effects, because that's what government pays attention to, economic effects. Okay, heat waves. Let's talk about heat waves. I'm going to go through all the details on the slide, just some important things here. It's important to note that heat waves already kill hundreds of thousands of people every year, especially in places like South Asia. So again, when I first made this slide back in 2003, I should update this at some point, I guess. About 35,000 people were killed in Europe alone, just in 1 week. India, every season, thousands of people die of direct sun exposure. And the important takeaway from this is that it's getting worse because of a number of factors, one of which is urbanization. So I think I mentioned a couple times in this course, at around 2010, we think, maybe plus or minus 5 or 10 years, an important thing happened in the history of human civilization. And that is, for the first time, we became an urban civilization. For the first time now, more human beings live in cities than in non-cities, i.e. countryside. And cities are innately temperature sensitive. There isn't tree cover. There isn't the softness of soil to absorb heat. There isn't as much shade. So if you're living in a city, especially if you're homeless, you're going to have to endure the direct intensity of the heat. Artificial surfaces, less cool, right? Cities have local carbon dioxide production. I remember the first time I went to China. This was 25 years ago. Geez, before you guys were born. When the Chinese economy was just exploding. I was in Shenzhen in the East Coast, where most of the activity was. I was shocked to see downtown core had factories smack downtown. Here, we do have some manufacturing left in Canada. The factories are in the outskirts because we figured out you don't put your CO2 producing factories where people are. But around the world, that's not true. We have CO2 producing plants and factories smack where everyone else is. So that's creating local issues. So we expect the heat wave frequencies to expect, and according to at least one projection, deaths in California alone, we don't think about California as being subject to heat deaths, but it really is, will double later this century. Okay, this graph shows us what I talked about earlier about urbanization. So the urban population has been increasing over the years, particularly in low-income developing countries. So, interestingly, heat waves are already the most deadly weather-related thing in the USA. We don't talk about it because it seems so unsexy, but it kills more people than all of these issues, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, etc. combined. So heat waves are already a problem, but we tend to just accept it as part of the background noise of human health. Next is floods and storms. So as we all know now, living in the era of hurricanes, floods and storms increasing at an incredible rate. And this has to do again with the energy input on the surface of the earth. That energy expresses itself in some ways, and in some ways expresses itself as power in storms. So what we have though today is less natural protection, erosion, coming again from urbanization, overdevelopment, and those wonderful things. I think I mentioned a few times that one of the problems we have, given our large population growth and given the extent of poverty in the world, is low quality shelter in places that are particularly vulnerable to this kind of exposure. So during the Asian tsunami, I think I mentioned that stupid paper that I wrote. I mentioned that, right? That I really regret. During the Asian tsunami in 2004, we saw a lot of incredibly poor people killed on the coast of Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka. And many people theorized, myself included, that this was a direct result of poverty. And it's true. I mean, if you weren't impoverished, you would live in better quality housing and probably not be as subject to the deleterious effects of those kinds of storms. And I predicted stupidly that if this happened in the USA, it wouldn't be the same because of the wealth, the movement of resources through FEMA, etc. And I was totally wrong because Hurricane Katrina and now the hurricanes of this year came and proved me wrong, because the Americans can be just as incompetent as everybody else. So poverty, while being a powerful factor, is confounded by incompetence and greed. So flooding is a huge issue, and I'll give you examples of where it's going to be particularly problematic here. So the Nile Delta, in particular, Bangladesh already sees yearly floods where hundreds of thousands of people are made temporarily homeless and now going to be permanently homeless. And we think that small islands like these guys, Tuvalu, Marshall Islands, are going to be completely underwater. By the way, Tuvalu, anyone know where Tuvalu's economy is based on? This will shock you. It has to do with the internet. So, every one of your favorite TV shows has a website. Do you know what the domain extension of your favorite TV show's website is? Game of Thrones, dot something. What's it dot? What's the after the dot? Huh? Those are com is .tv. There it is. .tv is the domain for Tuvalu. They own it. So the biggest singular chunk of their economy is based on selling their domain name to American TV shows. Isn't that crazy? And Mexico's .me. So I tried to buy fuck.me. They wanted $10,000 for that shit. So new. Then there's for a while the Czech Republic's was .ck, so I tried to buy big.co.ck. That was also $10,000. So I'm just have to entertain yourself somehow. So flooding is a huge issue, and we'll get back to flooding in a bit. But communicable diseases, I can't believe I put that on tape. That's not good. So communicable diseases are going to be a huge issue, and the most obvious pathway of their expansion is through vectors. A vector, of course, is a vehicle, a living vehicle that spreads a disease. A mosquito is the most well-known of these vectors. And they are strongly influenced by temperature, pressure, and weather changes. So I'll show you later on some of the maps of projected dengue changes of where we think they'll be more prevalent as a result of changing temperatures. And again, this, over history, this has been something that has changed over time. So it's not surprising it'll change again. It's just now it's changing as a result of this thing, this temperature change in the entire planet, and it's affecting a globalized economy. So that's why we are more susceptible. We are a large, vulnerable, singular, globalized civilization, whereas in previous generations we were pockets of civilizations that grew and fell. So we have a couple of factors happening here. We've got these vectors are moving now in unpredictable ways. They're possibly growing in population size due to having more habitats. But also we have more people with increased population densities. That may mean a faster spread of such diseases. In addition, we have, again, the globalized economy with rapid movement of peoples. So it's possible to get on a plane in Tokyo being pre-symptomatic for a disease and get off that same plane in New York, 12 hours later, or whatever, 14 hours later, and still not showing any symptoms, but spreading the disease that way. So people are becoming vectors as well. So here is, again, malaria transmission in 2000. This is Zimbabwe. So the redder the area, the more intense the malaria presence is. Okay, so that's 2000. In 2025, they think it'll look like that. So it's back in 2020, 2000, 2025. It's going to spread. And again, 2050, the entire nation is expected to be a malaria zone. And this is the dengue fever risk from 1990 to 2085. So here's this 1990, this is 2085 projected. So it'll grow from these slight areas to the entirety of Middle Africa, all of South Asia and Southeast Asia expected. Okay, water quality. This is one of those areas that we don't talk a lot about because people don't fully understand it, but there's some interesting studies coming out that suggest that the water issues are exacerbated by what's happening beneath the surface because we are digging now deeper, boring deeper wells to find underwater water sources. And I think a lot of urban people don't realize where their water comes from. For a lot of us, it comes from rivers, it comes from lakes, a lot of it comes from rivers from mountaintops, and a lot of it comes from underwater. And I've known people who think, oh, you just dig a well and this water is magically there. No, it comes from somewhere, right? It's part of this hydrodynamic system that's linked throughout the entire world. So the more you suck water out of these underground rivers, the more collapses we have. You've got sinkholes. That's the result of over-tapping. But also, it may be exacerbating the change in weather patterns as we access them more. I don't fully understand it. This is what I've been told. But it's something to keep in mind. Is there's stuff happening above the surface and stuff happening below the surface. So we've got the changing river patterns. We have the changes in rainfalls. I showed you that photo of Guyana. We can't predict when the next rain is going to be, so that really confounds our ability to make planning for our communities. And we misschedule when we think we need to plant our crops, when we think we need to plan our vaccinations, and so forth. So the safety of drinking water also becomes unpredictable. So we think right now there are at least 2 million deaths a year due to things like diarrhea, right? These are unclean water issues, and that's going to increase. So WHO estimates that at least 2.4%, probably more, of those water deaths are due directly to climate change. Air pollution. Okay, maybe you haven't made that connection yet, but air pollution is directly related to heat. So it's the carrying capacity of the ambient atmosphere is affected by its temperature. So that's probably why you remember it. I'm an asthmatic. If any of you are asthmatics, you're probably aware that in the summertime there's usually an alert. Stay indoors if you're asthmatic because there's a warning outside. The pollution thing is this or that, whatever it is. And it only happens in summertime. So as a result, with more hotter days, we expect to have more atmospheric pollutants nearer to the surface. So one model predicts that by 2050 in the US, due to global warming, ozone-related deaths will increase by 4.5%. So if you're in a country with very poor urban planning, as China is or was, they're getting better, then that will be a bigger issue. If your economy is based on manufacturing, hence pollution like this, that's going to be a bigger issue. Agriculture, as I mentioned, we tend to forget about agriculture, but it is the driving force of civilization, and it's deeply affected by climate change. So climate change affects agriculture by affecting how much we can produce, by affecting what we can do. So are we going to change how we use water? Are we going to change what kinds of pesticides we can use? Already that's an issue. It affects the intensity of the soil drainage, or the quality of the soil in general. It affects, again, how much space we have to grow. Desertification is a real thing. So the Sahara is growing. Right? Other deserts are growing. I mean, it's offset by maybe Antarctica will be fertile land in 500 years, so that'll offset it. Who knows? But the amount of space we think about having is definitely changing. And the species are also changing. What species? Well, the plants, in addition to their pollinators and their pests. So, here's some interesting quotes from various studies. So, Southern Africa could lose more than 30% of its main crop, maize, which is corn, by 2030. So, South Asia, we're losing all these staples, millet, maize, and so forth. As I mentioned, the poorest countries are hit first. The IPCC is the International Planet Panel for Climate Change. They're the global experts on climate change. They won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. So we think that the crop yield is reducing due to water issues and insect behaviors being a little sporadic, or complicated rather. And we think, this is a little scary one for me. So in some of these countries, the crops are near their tolerance already. That means places like in sub-Saharan Africa, where we think the problems are exacerbating, we can't rely on the crops to absorb that change, to be robust. They're already at their extreme tolerance. So we think that as a result, we're going to see reduces of up to 30% in agriculture production. That's not just on the surface. Marine life and the fishing industry will be affected according to the IPCC. Feeling scared yet? You should. Okay, here are some interesting connections you may want to think about. So we think that climate change will reduce food yield. Fine. We think that climate change will increase future hunger and undernutrition. Therefore, it's going to increase stunting, so people's height will decrease. We think that it's going to affect undernutrition through crop production. So many different ways it's going to affect the quality of health of individuals. That's just, a hand-waving argument right there. So migration is the big thing that governments pay attention to because it's in our face right now. And unlike planning for 50 years in the future, this is stuff we've got to plan for 5 and 10 years in the future. And there is a long established connection between migration and health. People who travel tend to be of poor health because they're stressed out. The large stress of large peoples on your border is ecologically bad. And of course, people need to be fed, sheltered, and cared for. We don't have a good track record of dealing with large numbers of refugees and migrants. This has led to a concept called climate refugees, which was written about in 1988. And we just saw our first case of actual climate refugees recently. I'll show you where that is in a second. First, in 2002, we had 1,400 Papua New Guinea residents. So this is in Southeast Asia. These islands were permanently sunk. Permanently, they're gone. These islands aren't there anymore. And so these people were homeless. Think about, we've absorbed how many Syrian refugees? About 20,000. That was huge. huge news, a huge issue for our country, and the political fallout is still being felt. 1400, the size of half my high school in Toronto. That's not so bad one would think. But then 2005, half of the Bangladeshi island became permanently flooded, leaving 500,000 people homeless. So someone has to absorb 500,000 people. India did mostly. Right? So these were thought to be the world's first climate refugees. Right? So that's a pretty shocking number. However, one projection by Christian Aid says that by 2050, 1 billion people will be displaced. 1 billion people. We can't handle 20,000. How do we handle 1 billion? So think about that. So that leads people to be a little bit concerned about what it means for border insecurity if in fact climate refugees becomes the signature for the latter half of this century. So we have high tension areas already exist. So India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh already share a basin of water, right? A basin is a geographical area in which a series of rivers emerge. And India and Pakistan are technically still at war, right? These are nuclear powers at a standoff, but they have agreed to share their water source in a certain shaky alliance. And any given time, they could decide not to. So there's a glacier called Siachen on the Pakistani border. It's a glacier, and both armies stand there every day, staring across each other, fully armed. And all it takes is one little thing to set them off. Every now and then there is a skirmish, but they sit on that glacier for a couple of reasons. One, because that's an important border part, but also because the glacier represents the water source that they want to control. In the Middle East, these four nations, Lebanon, Israel, Iraq, and Iran, also share a common water source. There is a theory that one of the reasons the Americans invaded Iraq was to control the water source of this area. It's a conspiracy theory, but it's not a bad reason. So we need water for drinking and agriculture. You also need it, though, for transportation and industry. As we'll see when we look at China, flowing water is needed to help operate factories. And that used to be our case here, but we don't manufacture as much anymore. But China relies heavily on its river supply for that purpose. So we also need flowing water for hydroelectric power, so dams and things like that. And that can lead to conflict. So if you dam your river, whoever is downstream from that river is now denied access to your water. That can be seen as an act of war, and historically it has been. So how you treat your water supply can have profound deleterious consequences on your relationships with your neighbor. So here's some historical data. We know that water has triggered wars in the past. So in eastern China, between 1000 and 1911, water has been known to be triggered by climate, but also correlated with war. So that's a nice ecological study there. Israel-Lebanon almost went to war in 2003 over access to a water supply. And I love this because this always shuts up my right-wing friends, is the Pentagon issued a paper in 2007 saying that climate change is the greatest security threat to the USA in the coming century. It's not terrorism, it's not rogue nuclear weapons, it's not the Russians, it's climate change, because they believe that diminishing resources will create sufficient refugees, which will be a direct threat to American security. So they have a lot of their modeling now is based on a climate refugee threat, and so they're planning whatever tools they need, whatever weapons and ordnance they need to fight climate wars in the future. It's a weird thing, but it's interesting to have in the heart of the right-wing denial stream, the Pentagon of all places, backing climate change as a real thing, mostly as a security issue. And of course, a study from Princeton says that water is the central global warming problem for the USA. So access to water, managing water, using water as a weapon. So here's a case study. This is from Washington State, looking at the effects of climate change on their local economy. They're going through all of these, but little things. They think by 2040 they'll have to spend $16 million in water conservation. They're going to have hydropower revenues down by this amount of dollars because of decreased water flow. They think they're going to lose $6 million per year of dairy revenue because the cows will be less productive. They think their crops will be reduced. They think they have to spend this much money on protecting their shoreline, etc., etc., etc. This is like, $500 million that they expend. That's not necessarily a wealthy state. Right? So that is a wealthy state compared to the rest of the world. So if this state in the heart of the wealthiest nation in the history of humankind is going to struggle like this, how will more impoverished places do? What is Canada doing? Well, Canada focuses on weird things like psychosocial effects of climate change. I don't know what this is all about. So they got this report, climate change and health, I don't know, whatever. I'll leave that there. But what I try to stress with students is to think about the way that things interact with each other, so the synergy of climate effects. So here we've got a case of drought causing malnutrition, which causes migration. But once you migrate, you're exposed to different kinds of diseases and new vectors. So that affects population health. You've got floods can cause diseases like cholera and diarrhea. They can destroy infrastructure, as we're seeing, in Texas and Puerto Rico, and that weirdly can make oral vaccines less effective because the oral fecal route is not compromised. We have climate change cause urban heat waves, and that actually could cause you to use air conditioners more, and that actually increases the demand for electricity, and that makes for the use of coal plants. So all of this is this spiraling effect. More Health Canada nonsense. I won't spend so much time on it. But Health Canada, they don't know what to do, so they stress, well, if you've got asthma, you should be careful, and you should look for your mental health, whatever. I don't know why. I don't mean to be dismissive of this, but it's very much a first world issue here. We're to look after your mental health. How about looking after the actual environment? That'd be nice. So, yeah. But they do recognize that there's going to be loss of income and productivity in Canada, perhaps a diminished quality of life. Things about in Canada, though, Canada is projected to be one of the countries to do fairly well as a result of climate change in some ways, because our north will become more habitable and possibly arable land will emerge, even though the soil quality of the north may be problematic. But the Northwest Passage, which was a fabled shipping route for many years, is going to be real. It's going to be real. In 25 years, we will actually have a shipping route from the North Atlantic to the Pacific for the first time ever. And that's going to be a great moneymaker for Canada. In fact, there's a great secret war happening between Canada and other circumpolar nations to claim aspects of the North in preparation for the Northwest Passive opening up. In fact, I think the Russians dropped a flag on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean as a way to sort of claim that area surreptitiously. It's a weird little secret war happening. But look for it. Looking to make money for your grandkids? Buy some Arctic land. It'll be worth something soon. Okay. So all kinds of projection studies that people have been tried, and I can't cite them all, but here's a little sample. So here's a study in 2006 of the health impacts of Oceania, which is Southeast Asia, for 2050. So I won't go through all this, but they expect things like expansion of dengue, right? Expansion of malaria, expansion of diarrhea admissions for the Aboriginal children. So unsurprisingly, a consistently vulnerable population, Aboriginal kids, are expected to be more vulnerable because we do a very poor job of protecting the vulnerable. So for sub-Saharan Africa, as I mentioned, the most benighted part of the world for years, for 2030, we think that more dying from flooding will be increased by twice. An increase in malaria deaths, increase in malnutrition, an increase in diarrhea due to water control issues, despite all the positive things I said last time about increased wealth happening in the world. So in my last lecture, I mentioned the demographic transition and increased wealth and development, all those great things. But I also said the great confounder is climate change. So that prevents us from drawing a straight growing line of wealth towards a demographic transition. If these fundamental ecological issues prevent us from reaching transition, then these nations will continue to suffer. This used to be a sobering statistic, now it's kind of taken for granted, but we think that over 150,000 deaths happened in 2000, that the result of activities in the 70s. Let's say that again. So as a result of human activities in the 1970s, the climate changes felt in year 2000 resulted in 150,000 deaths. The takeaway from that is it takes about 30 years for human activities to be manifested as measurable outcomes in population health. And governments historically have a bad history of understanding delayed effects like that. They want to see results in 4 to 5 years. So all of a sudden, if we cut greenhouse emissions by 100% today, in 4 years if they see no change, they'll say, well, that was a waste of effort. No, because it'll take a generation or two before we see positive impact. In fact, we can have emissions down to 0 today, and we'll still see climate change happen at least for 100 years or so. It'll take that long for the ship to slow down. So, the WHO's official position is that rapid climate change poses substantial risk to human health. Therefore, we support actions to reduce human influence. This is a fairly obvious statement, but it has to be stated because of the nature of climate change denial. It's important that we actually state that we must act on it. So I used to have a similar quote from the Canadian government back when there's a Liberal government 8 years ago, but then there's a Harper government that was in place, and they took it down again. But before the Harper government, Canada had a similar statement saying, we understand there's disagreement over whether or not it's a real thing. Not really. But given the risk posed to human health, if it is real, we must act on it. But that was taken down by the Harper government because they are climate change deniers. Okay, important issues. So, denial slows down investment. So, it's kind of like science denial. There's a famous climate change denier. His name was Bjorn Lomborg, and he wrote an important book called The Skeptical Environmentalist. And in it, he purported to reanalyze climate change data for several decades and show that it's not real. Bjorn Lomborg is not a statistician or an economist. He's a political scientist who plays with data. So after absorbing the hatred of the climate change crowd for years, he finally, a few years ago, said, you know what, I was wrong. It is a real thing. Forget what I said earlier. But he said, but now it's too late to do anything. So in fact, we should just focus on spending the money on other things. So I think he's a horrible man, and as a result, he was cited so often by the right wing as a quote unquote scientist who says it's not real that his articles were used as fuel to prevent action on these issues. So the fact that today he's changed his mind, well, screw you, Bjorn Lomborg. But before Bjorn Lomborg, there was another famous paper that was cited by the right wing to prevent investments in climate change. That paper was written by, I think, Taylor and Taylor. And it did a similar thing. It reanalyzed climate change data and showed that it wasn't real. However, the paper wasn't real. The paper was actually an opinion article written by the Wall Street Journal masquerading as a science article. It was formatted as I should bring it for you. I forgot to bring it on the slide deck. It was formatted as a peer-reviewed science paper, but it was actually a paid advertisement in the Wall Street Journal. And the authors were, in fact, running a homeschooling outfit in Oregon. They weren't actual scientists. Now, when the scientific community heard about this, they petitioned the Wall Street Journal for them to write a response, and the Wall Street Journal refused. So that's a heavy politicized nature of this process. You've got heavy moneyed heavy hitters like the Wall Street Journal who are investing in fake science and preventing actual science from being well heard. And that, over time, has slowed down investments in the projects to address these issues. So I believe that denial is a kind of criminal activity that slows down our ability to address these problems. Now, it also affects different regions in different ways. So I mentioned Canada, it may actually be a positive thing for a lot of people. In other places, it'll be horrible. So we can't have a one solution approach. One thing we can do is this. So poor countries can't afford to do a basic risk assessment. As a result, if you don't know which of your crops are at greatest need, which of your populations are suffering from what is the projected outcome if your rivers stop flowing, then you can't plan accordingly and you can't contribute to the global conversation of what's happening to the world. So there's an opportunity to create something like a climate fund, and this is being done. And the climate fund would allow poor countries to access money to do things like surveillance and long-term planning and risk assessment. We have this problem with people moving even faster to cities. Is it a problem? I don't know. Moving to cities hastens the demographic transition, which is a good thing. On the other hand, it makes people vulnerable to climate change and may increase climate change. As well, people are rushing to the coast. So the biggest cities in the world are on the coast. Why? Because that's where the ships are. That's where trade is. So as that increases, people become more vulnerable and the problem gets worse. We cannot predict food production issues. I mentioned before that food production seems to be okay, that our biggest problem is transportation and storage, but we don't know how climate change is going to affect food production in 100 years. We think mass migration is highly likely, especially coming from places like Bangladesh. And we think that conflict resulting from that migration is also likely. So this requires a global solution. So let's talk about China and water, because China is a fascinating case. The Americans always point to China and India as being, such great contributors to the problem that why should they do anything if the Chinese aren't going to do anything? But the Chinese are doing something. They're actually ahead of us in many ways in terms of, reducing their impact on climate change. So right now, China uses almost all of its water. And this is a problem. We don't use nearly. We use a fraction of our water, which is why countries try to buy our water. I believe there was some talk during the Harper years that he had actually sold an entire Canadian lake to the Chinese. I'm not sure how true that is, but some of that was going on. So almost all their lakes are completely polluted, so much so that they can't be accredited for human use. And why? Because of their economics. They need to manufacture. A manufacturing economy is an environmentally problematic economy. You need to take things out of the ecology, you need to pollute it, you need to grind it down to bits, you need to push things into the water and pull things out of the water. The glaciers are shrinking. And the glaciers is where we get a lot of our fresh water. And as a result, these rivers are being affected, the Yangtze, the Yellow, the Brahmaputra, and so on. And these rivers feed millions of people downstream. So that may lead to conflict. If suddenly you're polluting your neighbors, they're not going to like it. China uses 7 to 15 times more water to produce a unit of GDP than other developed nations like us. Right? So that's because, again, of their manufacturing economy. We use very little water to produce our GDP because we're all about finances and services. So as a result, if they transition their economy to a financial economy, as they will eventually, then this should slow down. So look at this. This graph shows us the cubic meters per persons per year of water use. South America is water availability. So South America has a lot of water, right? China has the least amount of water available, less so than the Sahara nations. Okay, so desert nations have almost as little water as China in terms of usability for its people. So let's talk about greenhouse gases. So greenhouse gases are still increasing, particularly in China and other parts of the industrialized world where manufacturing is happening. So here's some interesting stats. So things like malnutrition expected to increase, malaria expected to increase, all the predictable stuff. This shows us in 2000, the deaths attributed to climate change alone. So the redder, the worse. Unsurprisingly, sub-Saharan Africa struggles the most. Africa in general and South Asia are also affected. I mentioned in the last lecture that there is a call to reduce population growth, and the rationale being because people have a huge ecological footprint. But, the great caveat there is the greatest population growth is here, in these reddish-orange areas. But the greatest environmental footprint is in these areas. Because you and I use tens of thousands of times more resources and have tens of thousands of times greater impact on climate change than any people here. Right? So the population growth may be here, but these are not the people responsible for environmental catastrophe, but they are suffering from it. So, here's that Canadian website quote from 1999. Where there are threats of irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent these things. In other words, yeah, there's some people saying we don't know if it's real, but that's not sufficient reason for us not to take steps. That has been removed. That statement has been removed in the Harper years. I don't know if it's back yet or not. So this is heavily politicized stuff. What's being done? So what the WHO does is what they've always done, and that is raise awareness. I hate raising awareness. Yes, it's something you do in high school, but at some point, stop talking about it and do something. This is true for everything. Like when students come to me all the time with, we have our awareness raising campaign. Good for you. But what else are you going to do? What else you got? Okay, that's easy. Just tweet some shit. That's easy. Yeah. What else you got? So they advocate for green infrastructure and all the good stuff. The Global Climate Change Fund I talked about as being a good thing. So that's a workable, economic, measurable, impactful intervention that can be done immediately as a way to get poor nations to understand their problem and to have solid data that we can use. Things need to done include disease surveillance. We don't know where the problems are. We don't know how to respond in the case of disease outbreaks. And we need some international bodies for managing shared resources. Amazing, like I said, India and Pakistan have not gone to war over the Siachen Glacier or other water sources. Middle Eastern countries have not yet gone to war over water, but they might. So if there's a way to formalize some kind of appeal process for managing those conflicts, that's a functional thing to do. So we need to do more research. We need to understand how crops will behave, how the vectors will change, those kinds of things. Yeah, screw that. Here, this is a climate change model that shows us where things affect and where research needed. I know it's confusing. I show it here to show that there's complex systems thinking in place to understand how these things meld together. And here's another way of looking at it. Climate change affects human exposure to things like heat waves and extreme weather events, and that affects things like microbial changes, right? So the pathway of contamination of your food, that's a little unpredictable, right? And so on. Back for a second. So there are some modulating influences, like how much wealth you have, access to services. Do you understand clean water issues? Do we have genetically modified crops? But ultimately, these negative effects are processed through the modulating influences, and that gives us effects like how much diseases we have. So in 2012, the WHO launched an Atlas of Health and Climate. And here are some slides from this atlas that shows us climate change at a glance. This shows us changes in environmental indicators from 1750 to essentially present day. The takeaway are things like, where's a good one? A good one would be shrimp farm production, right? Suddenly we're producing a lot more shrimp, right? And we think shrimp are actually amongst the most damaging and deleterious of farming products, because they're damaging to the ocean wildlife. CO2 production increased dramatically in the last few years. So those are obvious ones. Sea level rise over the coming millennium. So we think that it's going to peak, the actual rate of rise will peak in 2050, but sea level rise will continue on well into the millennium, even if everything stopped today. So we think that there's going to be a lot more coastal flooding, so small island states are a particular vulnerability. A lot more storms, crop production, all the good stuff we talked about already. What should people be doing? Well, they recommend there should be emergency management preparedness. There should be better government responses like central population health issues. And there should be attempts to look at cost-saving adaptation strategies. Let's do that. This is just, I'm showing you random slides to show different ways of conceptualizing the program, because no one really knows how to think about this the right way. And if you want to make this your career, you can. There's space for you to contribute intellectually, right? So this is a framework for policy by the CDC. What they've done is they've looked at the weather events that are deleterious, the probable health effects of those weather events, and who's going to be affected. So this is the kind of thing you present to a policymaker to say, this is how we think about the problem. How do we create policy to protect these people, like the low, the poor, the elderly, and the children, from malnutrition? And CDC has responded with this. paper saying we're going to, in the event of a climate issue, we're going to expand our capacity for modeling. We're going to lead the governmental level on certain issues. So all that very unhelpful, I'm sure. So I want to leave you with this thought. That is, the barrier to addressing climate change is economic, meaning that people say we can't do this, this, and this because it costs too much money. On the other hand, if we don't do these things, we'll get poor health and other kinds of deleterious outcomes, and that's going to have a negative effect on our economy. So one way to look at this is this failure to act is economically damaging. Therefore, we must act. We focus a lot now on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. However, if we brought that down to zero today, you would still see negative effects for years, if not generations to come. So no matter what happens, we're going to see increased problems for the rest of your life. And lastly, there are no strategies for reversing climate change. It's like atherosclerosis. You can take Lipitor to slow it down, but no one knows yet how to remove plaque from your arteries. So all we know now is policies for stopping the symptoms. We don't know how to change the cause. Are you depressed, my children? Good. But maybe the aliens are coming. They'll solve it for us. So that's where I'll leave you. Thank you very much. Oh, by the way, I'm not here Thursday. So Thursday is the first of those YouTube video things with the built-in quizzes, right? Hopefully that works. If not, I'm sure somebody will tell me. Right? Yeah? Cool. Yes?
So do we have to do it on that day?
No. I think there's like a 48-hour period.
Okay.
Yeah, you can watch I think I forgot what I set it up for. I think you've got it, you can watch it anytime during that day or the next 2 days. I think you've got to do the test within 48 hours. Somebody email me or remind me and I'll check on it. I think I set it up for 2 days.
Can you put it after?
After the what?
After
Look, it's 5 questions. It's like literally what happens at the 2-minute mark. It's the same as attending a lecture. In fact, it's less than attending a lecture. It's like watching a 20-minute video and answering 2 questions, I think it is.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.